I learned to run the way my mother learned to pray, by doing it when no one was watching and pretending it made me safe. When she told me the story, she never started with the man. She began with the heat, the feel of it pressing on her shoulders like a hand. Jackson in late summer, light slanting gold on brick and pine, gnats orbiting faces as if people were planets. The air so heavy it held sound like a bowl holds water. She'd say that every footfall she made sounded trapped inside the heat, slapping against the pavement and then floating up as if it didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't understand that image until I started going out at dusk myself, after work, tracing her old route the way a finger traces embossed letters. I didn't live in Jackson anymore. I'd moved 2 states over, took a job that paid just enough to keep dread and debt neck and neck. But I mapped the streets as she described them, adjusted for the wrong city, the different trees, the way light worked here. I ran past a boarded-up laundromat that stood in for her boarded-up grocery. I ran through the sound of a loose streetlight wire humming like a wasp trapped in glass. I ran toward a church that wasn't her church, a rectangular brick building with a white sign out front. And I told myself it would be there for me if I needed it. She says she knew the moment he fell in beside her, not because of his shadow, but because of how her breath sounded in her head. It went from a rhythm to a stutter. She didn't see him at first. She felt the fact of him. The footsteps were wrong. Not quite behind her, not quite beside her. As if he were making his sound in her chest. She said she lengthened her stride, and he matched it without rushing, the way a tall man does when he's sure he'll catch you anyway. What did he look like? I asked when I was younger, half hoping for a monster and half hoping for a cop's sketch. Tall, she'd say, and laugh as if the word were a trick. Tall, like you could see him in a crowd without trying. Grey curly hair, not old grey, just grey like wool. His clothes weren't dirty. That made it worse. Like he came from somewhere respectable, but didn't belong to it. And his face? I don't remember, she'd say, and her eyes would move to a corner of the room as if that was where the face had gone. My mind didn't want to give it a place to sit. But his voice... Her mouth would flatten. She'd look at her hands. His voice was like a song I ought to know. The first time she told me the opening line, I felt my body mistake the sofa cushion for the seat of a car and brace for impact. You know who I am, and you know what I want. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. The sentence held it, like a throat holds a swallowed thing. My mother said she answered without meaning to. No, like she was correcting a student who'd gotten a math problem barely wrong. But she did know, some part of her. She insisted on that years later, in the kitchen on a woman-cold morning when the sunlight was too white to be kind. It wasn't like a stranger trying to be familiar, she said. It was a familiar thing, pretending to be a stranger. I started collecting the rest of it, the way you collect glass you don't remember breaking. Carefully and angry at yourself for bleeding. He asked her where she lived, if she ran every day, and if she liked the neighborhood. Casual questions. The kind you answer by reflex because it's easier to keep the machine of conversation running than to jam it with fear. She lied without planning. Oh, just visiting my sister, she said. I take different routes. She didn't have a sister. She didn't take different routes. But the lies sounded thin in the air. like thread pulled too tight. She cut her run short. She could see the apartment from half a block away. 3rd story, 2nd from the left. The one with a window that caught late light and made the living room look like whiskey. The lock on that apartment door was a running joke with my father. He'd jiggle it, swear, jiggle it again, declare it had a personality that didn't like men. My mother would laugh and jiggle until the bolt gave up with a long-suffering sigh. She had a key, but it preferred to test her. That day, the key turned as if the door had been waiting for her. She felt the teeth bite, felt the bolt slide, smooth, slick, an inhale opening a throat. She stepped in and turned the chain with a click that sounded like a small animal being snapped in half. She didn't ask why. She didn't think. She leaned her whole weight against the wood and listened. The hall outside swallowed sound and gave it back as footsteps. Then the knock. Not loud. That made it worse, she said. It was a polite knock, the kind a neighbor uses when they don't want to cause trouble. You know who I am, the voice said through the door. The wood flattened it. And you know what I want. What do you want? My mother asked, and felt the question arrive too late, like a door closing after someone has already stepped through. He laughed, and the laugh was the sound of someone not laughing saying the word laugh. She told him she was calling the police. She wasn't. The phone felt like a fake prop on a stage where real things had just started happening. She told him she had a husband who would be home any minute. My father was teaching night classes then. He wouldn't be home for hours. She told him to leave, or the man upstairs would come down. There was no man upstairs. He said nothing, which is worse than a word. Then footsteps in retreat. Then nothing. It ought to end there. Most stories like this do. The not quite crime, the woman who did everything right, the relief that is also a humiliation, because relief is not a victory, it's a permission. But she didn't feel permitted. She felt enclosed. She crossed the room to the window and looked down onto the street. The church across from the apartment building, Bethel House of God, was lit up like a box of teeth. She joked about it once, the ugliness of the light. How fluorescent bulbs make even angels look like factory workers. That night, it was beautiful. The sign out front showed a verse about deliverance. The letters were black on white, and a moth wobbled over the O like a drunk halo. She grabbed her sneakers, stuck her feet into them without socks, and ran. My mistake, she told me later, was thinking sanctuary was a place. As if a room could keep something out that had already gotten in. She crossed the street on a red because the world had narrowed to a single verb. Go. A car braked hard. A horn split. She flinched as if the horn were a hand. She went up the church steps 2 at a time and tried the door. Open. Not just open. Easy. The way the apartment door had been easy. The lock that had fought them for months now bent for her. She stepped into cool air that had been breathed by singing. The sanctuary smelled like paper and dust, and the sharp sweetness of disinfectant. She moved down the aisle like a woman late to her wedding. The pastor's office light was on. A man looked up from behind a desk piled with pamphlets that taught grief how to behave. He was small and exhausted, and he smiled the way people do when they've been trained to smile even when their bones hurt. My child, he said, and my mother hated him instantly for the phrase. But she sat. She told him the story in a voice that belonged to her but sounded rented. She left out the part about the lock because she did not yet know it mattered. She left out the part where the man's voice had sounded. No, not sounded, felt. Like a song she ought to know. The pastor listened as if listening were a job. He said the right things. He offered a prayer. He called a deacon to walk her home. The deacon was 6 feet of quiet, with a ring of keys that jingled like a joke about authority. They crossed the street. They checked the stairwell. It was empty in the way rooms are empty after having been full of something you can't name. "Do you feel safe?" the deacon asked at her door. She wanted to say no. She said yes because dignity wins small arguments and fear picks bigger ones. When she told me this, she paused. And for once, I didn't fill the space with a question. The questions I asked when I was a teenager were the wrong kind. Why didn't you call the police? Why did you open the door? Why did you go to the church instead of a neighbor? I was older now, and fear had wised me up. A better question bloomed and waited. She finished her glass of water, as if the last swallow might be the one that kept her alive. "I don't know why the lock worked for me," she said. "I don't know why the church door opened so easily. I don't know why he didn't try harder." "Maybe he didn't need to," I said. And the look she gave me was a mirror I wish I had covered. It would have been a story we told at holidays. Mama's creepy runner story, if not for 2 other things that happened years later to people my mother never met. They shared their versions with friends of friends, who soothed, repeated, and embellished, just like any living story does. The changes were in the details. The core was a cinder that stayed hot. A woman in Tennessee heard a voice outside her window that used her dead sister's way of saying her name. It said, "You know who I am." A man in Oregon answered his intercom at midnight and listened to a delivery driver recite the last conversation he'd had with his ex-wife, verbatim, then end with, "You know what I want." My roommate in college told me both stories on a night when the dorm heaters clicked like someone counting. And all I could think of was my mother's face when she told me the line, how it sounded like something that had grown up inside the shape of her mouth and then moved out. I ran more after that. I told myself it was for my health. I told myself it was to get my breath back. I told myself it was to make the stories small by outpacing them. On my runs, I started to listen not just for footsteps, but for echoes. Some nights, the sound of my feet came back to me just a fraction not right, late by a hair. I counted in 8s like a dancer to make sure. I changed shoes. I ran on asphalt, then on a track, then on a path made of ground-up tires that swallowed sound. The echo followed. On the nights I heard it, it felt like someone tapping the inside of my ribs with one finger. I kept my mother on speakerphone sometimes, letting her voice fill the air beside me like a second shadow. "You worry too much," she'd tease. I was fine. I am fine. "You left Jackson," I'd say. "Everybody leaves somewhere," she'd say back, which wasn't an answer, but had the force of one. When the knock came for me, it didn't come on a door. That courtesy felt old-fashioned now. It went on a pane of glass the size of a book, an ordinary window over my sink with a sill too narrow to hold anything but a small plant. It came in 3 taps spaced too far apart to be social. I had been washing a mug I didn't like. I had been thinking about the way my mother described the past as tired smile. I had been humming a hymn I did not remember learning. Tap, tap, tap. I looked up and saw my face reflected in front of me first. That's the trick of night windows. You see yourself before you see outside. My face looked young, and then, in the exact moment, old, as if the glass had to try 2 different truths to see which fit. Through the reflection, a shape stood on the strip of back lawn between my building and the fence where ivy braided the slats like hair. Tall, curly gray hair. Those are the words I have. The rest of it was not a face. It was a decision to be a face, and then think better of it. I didn't move. The water ran over my hand like a small river that had forgotten its source. The shape lifted its chin the way my mother does when she's about to say something unforgivable in a voice full of love. You know who I am. I heard it without sound. The words pressed the air down. The words reached me through the bones of the building, through the pipe and the wire, through the small plant on the sill that leaned its leaves toward it like a question. I think that if my mother had been there, she would have said, "Close your eyes," and I would have obeyed to do the right thing. But I was alone, and loneliness is a poor instructor. "You can't be," I said, and my voice sounded as if it had traveled from far away and arrived out of breath. "You can't be him." The window replied with a soft answering thud, like a heartbeat attempting language. My phone lay on the counter on top of the day's mail. I could have picked it up and called a friend, the police, or my mother. I could have. Instead, I turned off the tap with careful fingers, as if the sink were listening, and reached for the latch on the window. It had always been a sticky thing, resisting me as if it were made of old gum. That night, the latch lifted as if it were someone else's hand doing me a favor. The window slid up without complaint. The air that came in smelled like damp soil and the last of the day. "Don't," I told myself, and then I did. I leaned into the square hole I'd made and looked down. No one. No man with gray hair. No anything. Just the rectangle of the yard, the fence where ivy wrote in a language that didn't need vowels, a plastic tricycle someone had left behind like an argument they'd lost. I listened for footsteps withdrawing into the dark like a tide. I heard a leaf turn over, which is almost a sound. I listened to my blood. The voice crouched beside my ear like a friend about to confess a sin. "You know what I want?" It used my mother's voice. Not her speaking voice. The one she uses on telephones or to the lady at the pharmacy. Her laughing voice. The voice that had told me secrets about my father, the small mean ones, while slicing fruit that made the knife smell like coins. It wore that voice like a coat that used to fit. "What do you want?" I asked. My mouth was pressed against the screen, leaving a small grid on my lip. It didn't answer with a word. It answered with a feeling. The feeling of a lock turning easily, of a door opening to you as if you were expected, of air holding sound so tenderly that you think noise can't hurt you because it will never leave the air's soft hands. I slammed the window, fumbled the latch, and made it stick the way it should. I stepped back and kicked the cabinet and felt the satisfying ache of actual pain, the kind that proves your body is yours. I turned on every light I owned. I sat with my back against the fridge, legs out, hands pressed flat to the tile, and waited for my breath to remember how to count. I called my mother. "Mom," I said, and already I hated the word for being a smaller version of a bigger sound. "I think," she answered before I finished. "You're fine," she said, using that voice that can pick you up even when you're heavier than your worst day. "I felt you thinking about it earlier. I was going to call. Did you say the words?" "What words?" "You know who I am," she said, and my neck turned cold as if someone had poured milk down the back of my shirt. "And you know what I want. Did you say that back?" "No," I said. "No, I didn't say anything like..." "You should have." Something in her tone shifted, not toward anger, not toward worry, toward attention. "Say them now. Say them out loud, so it knows you know." "Mom, where are you?" "At home," she said, and then casually, "Across the street. The church is open tonight. I might walk over." I stood. The room telescoped slightly, distances softening like bread. "Across what street?" "Don't be silly," she said gently. "You know which one? The one with the sign. I like the verse tonight. It's about deliverance." She had not lived across from a church in years. The last place she'd lived outside of memory was a beige condo with a pool that saw more leaves than people. The change washed through me like a tide that carried sand away from my feet until I felt the ground shift. "Mom," I said again. And now the word was just a mouth position, passing for a prayer. "What did you open for it?" A small silence. I could hear the shape of her room inside it, the clink of a glass, the hiss of air through a vent that hadn't been cleaned, the sticky adjustment of a chair leg against linoleum. Then, I didn't open anything it didn't already have the key to. The refrigerator hummed as if warming up to sing. I reached for the light over the stove and turned it off. The apartment leaned into the dark. A neighbor upstairs walked across their kitchen and put something heavy down, and the sound traveled into my body like a bruise. I moved to the window and placed my palm against it. Cool. My hand left a print that looked like a flower trying to remember its original shape. "Tell me what you want," I said into the glass. "Say it. If you know me, say it." The voice that answered was my own, younger, the way it had sounded on an old voicemail where I'd told my mother not to worry. The way voices always tell mothers not to worry when they mean, please worry. It said my name the way you say a word right before you look it up to see if it's spelled the way you think it is. You. Just that. As if the word were a house, it was inviting itself in. I closed my eyes and saw the lock turn easily. I saw the church door open like a mouth. I saw a tall man's grey hair like wool under a lamp. I saw a pastor's tired smile. I saw a deacon's kind hands. I saw my mother looking at her hands while she told me the part where she ran across the street and survived. "You're not a stranger," I said. "You're not a man. You're not outside." Silence like a held breath. "You're the thing that finds the open part of a person and calls it a doorway." I was proud of that sentence for half a second. Then I realized I'd heard it before, not in words but in a feeling. The first time I'd opened a message from someone I shouldn't have forgiven. The first time I'd let a small lie stand because it was shaped like mercy. The first time I'd mistaken relief for safety. It didn't need to be true. It only needed to feel efficient. The phone against my ear grew heavier. "Are you with me?" I asked her out loud, the way you ask a child in a store to answer, so you know where to find them. "I'm always with you," my mother said, and the sentence slid into the room like a shopping cart wheel that doesn't squeak anymore because someone oiled it with something slicker than oil. I opened my eyes because I was afraid to see what I would know if I didn't. Through the window, the yard sat like a photograph of itself. The fence wrote nothing. The plastic tricycle did not move. A moth tried the glass once and fell back into the air as if embarrassed. I could have believed I had invented everything. The mind is a generous liar when it wants to keep you whole. I turned the latch on the window the way you touch a sleeping person's wrist to make sure they're warm. It stuck. I smiled with my teeth. "Good," I said to nobody, the way you say good dog when you don't own a dog. "You should come over," my mother said in my ear. "It's late. You shouldn't be alone. I can make tea." "What kind?" "Something gentle," she said. "Something to quiet your heart." We never drank tea when I was growing up. Coffee, bitter and scalding. Soda, flat at the bottom of the glass. Tea belonged to other kitchens. I pressed the phone harder against my ear until my cartilage complained. "Say the line," I told her, and I didn't know which of us I meant to trap with it. "Say it the way you remember it." She didn't hesitate. "You know who I am," she said, and her voice was my voice, and then the voice was the man's voice, and then the voice was a girl's whimper from a playground I'd left decades behind. "And you know what I want." The apartment went colder in a way the thermometer didn't record. The plant on the sill leaned toward me again. My breath fogged the glass. Somewhere in the wall, something clicked, a pipe agreeing with a pipe. "What do you want?" I asked, because some rituals only work if you finish them. The answer came as the softest sound in the room, the sound of the chain on my front door settling against its bracket, a sigh of metal-like relief. I hadn't touched it. And then, from the hallway, a knock, polite, spaced too far apart to be social. Exactly where the door stood. I looked at the door the way you look at a word you've written correctly, and suddenly doubt. 3 knocks. A silence that let my heart find its rhythm and then forget it. My phone screen lit up in my hand. The call timer ran. The number at the top of the screen said Mum, but the name looked misspelled, though each letter was correct. I set the phone on the counter. I did not hang up. The knock came again, softer, like a courtesy extended to someone who had already agreed. I stepped toward the door and stopped at the church aisle that wasn't there. I wasn't in Jackson. I wasn't across from a sanctuary. I wasn't 22 and sweating. I was older and sweating for different reasons. I put my hand on the deadbolt. It turned as if it had been waiting for me. I closed my eyes and thought of every threshold I'd ever crossed without knowing the room's rules. I thought of my mother running across a street lit like a box of teeth. I thought of a pastor's prayer that was a sentence like a fence that keeps nobody out. I thought of the words that meant you belong to me, said 3 different ways to 3 other people in 3 different decades. I thought of relief dressed as safety, and kindness dressed as invitation, and comfort dressed as consent. I stepped back from the door. The knock came a final time, the way a last question does, as if the teacher were kind enough to repeat it. The phone on the counter spoke in my mother's voice, but the consonants wobbled like heat over asphalt. "Darling," she said, Don't be scared. Open up. I picked up the phone. I held it to my ear and breathed into the mouthpiece like a swimmer who's just broken the surface and can't believe air requires so little effort after so much water. "You can come in," I said, and tasted the wrongness of it like a penny under my tongue. "But you'll have to use the stairs." I set the phone down again. I turned all the lights off, one by one, until the apartment was the kind of dark that makes you aware of your angle in space. I stood in the middle of the room and let my hands hang at my sides, palms forward, like a person about to receive. The knock did not come again. The chain did not move. The window did not lift. The air did not get colder. The quiet became correct. When my phone finally made the sound that says a call has ended, it did not come from the phone. It came from the building itself. A slight tone like a bell remembering what being a bell is for. I stood there until my knees hurt. I stood there until the first pale suggestion of morning turned the window into a thing with intentions again. I have told myself a dozen endings to this. One in which I opened the door and found nothing. And that was the horror. One in which I opened the door and saw my mother, younger, holding a cup of tea that never steamed. One in which I removed the chain and the lock, and the door swung inward without my help, and I saw the church aisle and went down it like a bride. One where the tall man with the grey wool hair asked me gently if I'd like to go for a run. But the ending I have is this. Sometimes, late, I hear the 3 knocks from somewhere that isn't my door and isn't anyone else's. I let them pass through me the way heat does, carrying sound. I do not answer. I do not call my mother. I do not pray. And now and then, when I'm running at dusk and the gnats orbit me as if they've been told I'm their new son, I feel a set of footsteps fall in beside my own. Not behind, not beside, exactly, but somewhere within the frame of my ribs. I lengthen my stride. The footsteps do not hurry. A voice that is not a sound moves through me like a key being turned in a lock that has decided to be kind. "You know who I am," it says, patient, like a teacher giving you back your name. I keep running. I cut my route short. I do not go home. I do not go to church. I run until I find a room that doesn't have a door. I run until I don't know which is worse, that the voice belongs to something outside me, or that it doesn't.